in your absolute wildest dreams, you'd never expect anything like that. I mean, here are glass beads that had to be made in Europe, and they're over here in Northwest Alaska before Columbus ever left Spain. So yeah, it's like, holy God.
Ces petites perles bleues créent des remous dans le milieu scientifique depuis que les archéologues Michael Kunz et Robin Mills ont avancé l'idée qu'elles seraient arrivées en Amérique depuis l'Europe des années avant la découverte du Nouveau Monde par Christophe Colomb. Pour les deux archéologues qui travaillent depuis des décennies sur des sites inuits, les objets en verre ont parcouru les 17 000 km qui séparent Venise de l'Alaska quelques années avant 1492.
What it does show is that those European beads made in Venice could travel all across the Asian continent, across the Bering Strait, and into Alaska. And that is probably one of the best examples you're ever going to see of just the way trade can work, period.
La première fois que ces petites sphères bleues sont découvertes en Alaska, c'est en 1954 à Punic Point.
Over the course of his excavations, he found these blue glass beads, about 6 or 8 of them, and automatically assumed that it was part of a historic occupation of the site. He did not radiocarbon date the site. The process was in its infancy, and it hadn't attained the stature it has today. About 40 years later, we went to the site. So my team and I went up there and make determinations on if damage had been done to it. We also found spoons, knives, and forks from the original archaeology crew that they'd used to eat their dinners with, okay? But we also found artifacts, let's say, all associated together in probably an area of about 5 centimeters. What it turned out to be was there were 3 blue beads, 2 copper bangles, and 2 iron pendants, all in this little pile.
Cette équipe d'archéologues décide de réaliser une nouvelle estimation de l'âge des perles en utilisant cette fois-ci la datation par le carbone 14. Et pour cela, ils vont se servir de 7 ficelles végétales retrouvées avec les perles.
So you can't radiocarbon date glass, and you can't radiocarbon date metal, but you can radiocarbon date anything that ever was alive. So we had this twine wrapped around this bangle that we could radiocarbon date. When we dated the twine, the date came back between 1443 and 1488. Which was roughly a decade before Columbus ever made his initial voyage. So we were blown away. We couldn't believe it. We thought, oh my God, how could this be?
Les archéologues poursuivent leurs recherches sur d'autres sites à proximité et trouvent d'autres perles. Et après avoir analysé au carbone 14 du charbon de bois et des ossements de caribou retrouvés près des perles, les résultats tombent. Les dates de ces différents éléments coïncident.
Really? We went back and checked. We called the lab. We talked to the guys at the lab. Are you sure there's, no, they're good. The stuff you gave us to date, that's the date, So essentially what we've got now is we've got 3 sites with these blue beads in them, and they all overlap at some period of their date in the 1400s. I think we've got a pretty solid thing here.
Reste alors aux archéologues à identifier la provenance de ces perles. Et selon leurs recherches, à la fin du Moyen-Âge, un seul lieu pouvait produire ce type de perles en verre, la République de Venise.
As we investigated how the bead industry developed, we found out that the type of bead that we had found, its technical classification is 2A40, and it's known as early blue. It's a drawn bead finished by the Aspieio process. All right. I mean, they're undeniable. You look at it, and if you see the right stuff there, that's what it is. All right. The general rule is that any bead that was manufactured in the 15th century, in other words, the 1400s, had to come from Venice. So, since our dates all are in the 1400s for these beads, we said, okay, these have to be Venetian beads, as far as we're concerned.
C'est là qu'ils établissent leur hypothèse. Ces perles ont dû voyager par voie terrestre de la péninsule italienne jusqu'à l'Alaska.
Venice was the first European entity to really establish mercantile trade with the Orient, with Asia. The Silk Road, all right? Some of these beads got into some trade, caravan coming out of Venice. These caravans are going through all kinds of aboriginal territory where the natives that have lived there for thousands and thousands of years. And these caravan guys are trading for anything they can get. So if the natives want to trade them a bunch of furs for some cute little beads, they're going to do it, on the way to Beijing. So these beads got into the native population and the inter-native contact trade routes. And so they migrate across Asia into the Russian Far East. They're on the shore of the Bering Strait. The Bering Strait is only 85 kilometers wide. The Bering Strait Eskimos bring them across the strait to swap them with the Northwest Alaskan Eskimos. And that's how they got there. So that's the story.
Depuis la publication de leurs travaux, les archéologues ont reçu plusieurs commentaires qui mettent en doute leur théorie. Car selon des spécialistes des perles, la variété retrouvée en Alaska n'aurait en réalité commencé à être fabriquée qu'après 1500.
The type of beads that they found in Alaska, they're a type that archaeologists call the 2A40 variety. And they're manufactured by a process called drawn bead making. And so the glass is drawn out into a long hollow tube and then cut into short lengths and then rounded into the finished bead. So we know that drawn bead making in Venice wasn't invented until around 1470. And then this particular method of heat rounding the beads, it's primarily a 17th century technology, though it may have been in use as early as the late 16th century. The particular bead type here, the 2A40, all the archaeological evidence we have suggests that this type wasn't manufactured until the late 1560s.
Our narrative is that there had to be a developmental time period for making these beads. They just didn't wake up one morning and say, hey, Fred, I got a way to make beads. All right? We think those beads that we found in Alaska are beads that came from that developmental period before we find them being mass produced in Europe. As you would well imagine, there are a lot of bead researchers that don't necessarily agree with us. And so we get a lot of negative feedback simply because it's not the way it's supposed to be. And basically our response to that is, well, nothing is the way it's supposed to be until it isn't. All right, so that's it.
Even, 1570, 1600, 1630, it's still a really fascinating story because it's more than 100 years before, documented contact with Alaska.